I think you're starting to understand the concept. Now let's go back to React and we'll start looking at how this is actually applied in code. Before we can continue on with props, we need to take a quick aside to talk about something. We've learned how our components will be returning JSX, which is a special syntax of JavaScript, or rather, it's something that's created by React and allows us to write our React code in a very declarative way. However, one of the most common things that you'll find yourself doing is trying to insert values from JavaScript inside of your JSX. Right now, we just have some text inside of our H1, but let's assume we had a value like first name. Maybe this is Joe and a last name. Let's say Schmo. Think for a second, how would you change our H1 to no longer say hello world, but instead to say hello Joe Schmo? Well, we can probably see ahead of time that just trying to input first name, last name, or maybe even adding a space in there as if this were regular JavaScript, isn't really going to work. If I do this, I'm going to get the literal text of first name plus last name interpreted as the text content of my H1. Fortunately, React has made it really simple to interpret something as JavaScript instead of text when it's inside of a JSX element. And that is by simply surrounding it with a single set of curly braces, almost like it were an object. So at this point, before I even hit save, I'm going to give you a quick challenge. Simply enough, I want you to finish off the H1 that we have here so that it says, hello Joe Schmo. And actually, let's put an exclamation point in there for good measure. Pause the screencast and do this challenge. Well, if I hit save, we'll see that it interprets the Joe correctly. Instead of saying first name, it's now taking the value of our first name JavaScript variable and inserting it here. And then, of course, the rest of this text is still there. If I were just to surround last name, then I would get a little bit closer, but I still have my plus and my quotation marks. So at this point, I can just get rid of those, put a space in between my two values, hit save, and there we go. Hello, Joe Schmo. The way I like to think of this is that as soon as I start seeing JSX, the interpreter sort of goes into JSX mode. Anything after this greater than symbol is going to start being considered the text content, or in the case of having nested elements, other JSX elements, and we're currently in what you could call JSX land. However, as soon as we see this opening curly brace, we switch back into our JavaScript mode or JavaScript land, and then anything inside of my set of curly braces will be considered JavaScript. Once I get to this closing curly brace, I'm now back into JSX, which is why I have an actual space in the text between my first name and my last name. Then it sees my curly brace again, so I'm back in JavaScript land. The closing curly brace tells me I'm done with JavaScript. I get the exclamation point as part of my actual text. And then I close off my JSX tag. Now, once I enter JavaScript land, I can actually do more than just take in values from my JavaScript up above. In fact, anything that I put inside of my curly braces can be run as JavaScript code. Let me clean up this challenge really quick. Something that's important to note is that anything I put inside of my curly braces will be run as regular JavaScript code. So I'm not limited to just pulling in values like this. For example, I could do something like, say, I have a new date, which is a new date object, and then change this to something like it is currently about, and then run some JavaScript code inside of my curly braces saying date.getHours. And then let's say we want to do a modulo 12 so that we get the AM PM hours, or rather like on a 12-hour clock. I hit save and there we go. It's currently about 3. Maybe I say o'clock. And that's because for me, when I'm recording this, it's currently 3:21 p.m. And in fact, I wouldn't even necessarily need to create my date outside of here. I could say new date dot get hours, and I'm going to get the same result, even without doing it out here, because anything that I put inside these curly braces will be run as regular JavaScript. Now, personally, I think it's a lot more readable to do the actual JavaScript outside of my return value in my JSX. So if I were doing this in the real world, I'd probably say something like const hours equals date dot get hours modulo 12. And then inside of my render down here, all I'm doing is putting hours. And of course, we get the same result that way. One thing that's nice about doing it this way is you can sort of separate the logic that your component is running with the display that your component needs to show on the screen. So for example, let's say I wanted to say, depending on the time of day, good morning, good afternoon, or good night. Well, I could do all of my logic up here to determine what should display after the word good. For example, I want it to say good afternoon because for me right now it's afternoon. I could do something like this, and I'll probably speed this up so it doesn't take up too much time. All I've done really is created a changeable variable, let time of day, and then said if the current hours is less than 12, it's morning. If it's between 12 and 17, then it's afternoon, and otherwise it's considered night. I probably should make something for evening because 5 o'clock p.m. seems a little bit early to say goodnight to someone, but whatever. So here's another mini challenge for you. Okay, your challenge is simply to fix the H1 below to use the time of day string that we determined in the code above. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Simply enough, all we really need to do is remove the hard-coded afternoon, put a set of curly braces, and then say time of day. Now, of course, because it is afternoon for me, this will still say afternoon. I suppose I could just trick this. Maybe I change this to say if it's between 12 and 1, then we consider it afternoon, but otherwise it's good night. I should be able to hit refresh, and sure enough, it says good night. I'm going to change that back so that's not so weird. Okay, with that concept, we are primed to now jump back into props and to see what the syntax of props actually looks like. To help guide us through learning the syntax of using props in React, we're going to look at this little contact book that I created here. As you can see in our app component, everything is hard-coded. Each one of these divs, which I separated with a little space in between each one, represents one of the contact cards. But of course, all of the data is hard-coded inside, which means if I ever needed to make a change, especially to something like the styling, I'm going to have to make that change to every instance of this contact card that we see here. Before we can really talk about props though, we have a challenge for you, and that challenge is to create a separate component called contact, which as the challenge shows will be in a different file. And then I just want you to choose one of the contacts that we have here to move into that file. Essentially, you can just copy and paste one of these contacts over into your contact component. Then, once you've moved one of these contacts over to the contact component, I want you to import the contact component and render 4 instances of it here inside our app component. While you're working on that part of the challenge, I want you to think ahead what's going to be the problem with doing it this way. Okay, pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Okay, so I'll create a new file called contact.js. And in contact.js, we'll import React from React. We'll export default, our function contact. And for now, we're just going to copy and paste one of the contacts. Let's choose Mr. Whiskerson here. Okay, that should have been easy enough. Inside of app, we will then import contact from our contact file. And then instead of completely deleting all of these, because I think I want access to this data, I'm going to actually move them down outside of my component and then just comment them out. That way I still have access to them, but they're out of the way. And now I'm going to render 4 instances of my contact component. If you didn't make it this far, or you didn't take the chance to think ahead what's going to be wrong with doing it this way, I want you to think now, what's going to be wrong when I create 4 instances of this contact component? Well, if I hit save, we get 4 Mr. Whiskersons. And as much as we love Mr. Whiskerson, we still need the data from our other contacts here in our contact book. Why exactly is this happening? Well, when we copied one of the contacts and pasted it over, we pasted the data with it. Just like a function, let's say add 2 numbers, that takes no parameters and simply returns a hard-coded amount, in this case 1 plus 2, every time we call this function, it will always give us the same result. In the same way, our contact card has that data embedded inside of it or hard-coded in it, and therefore it's going to show up every time we make an instance of that component. Now, similar to how we instead will usually pass some parameters to a function which make it more flexible and reusable, I can say return a plus b, and now suddenly I have an infinite number of possibilities with this function because all I need to do when I'm calling it is pass in the real values that I want this function to use. We can do essentially the exact same thing in React. The remainder of this screencast is going to be focused on how we pass data into our contact component. And in the next screencast, we're going to look at how we can consume that data from our contact component so that we get back to a working state where we have 4 different contacts in our contact book. Let me delete this function. We'll go back to app.js and focus here on our instances of the contact component. Just like we talked about how HTML allows us to pass attributes which can alter the behavior of the element, React chose to do things in a very similar way. However, in HTML, where we are limited to using only the attributes that are allowed for any given element, for example, I couldn't pass a whatever I want attribute to a link tag because that's not defined in the HTML spec. With React, because this is a custom component, I can pass in any property or attribute that I want. We have 4 pieces of data in each one of our contact cards that we need to pass down to our instances of the contact component. So to do that, I can add an image prop, or let's call it img. This image prop can be the value of the path to the image. So I'll go ahead and copy that from Mr. Whiskerson here. Again, in the next lesson, we'll be learning how to actually consume these properties that we're passing in. But for now, we're just going to be dedicated to adding these properties to the contact component on our instances. Now, the upcoming challenge might be something that you decide you really hate me for giving to you. I'm going to do one more of these props, and then I will update our challenge to give you a chance to practice typing out your own props to each one of these contact cards. I'm going to put this on its own line because I already know I'm going to be adding a bunch of these. The next piece of data that I'll need in each one of my components is a name. So let's choose to call it name. I'll come down here and just copy Mr. Whiskerson's name and pass it in. And this is the point at which I'll update this challenge for you. Okay, once again, I promise I'm not doing this to be mean, but I do want you to do a little bit of busy work, mostly just to get your hands on the keyboard and start practicing what it's like to add your own props to this contact component. Remember, we get to decide what we call these props. We could call this whatever we want, but of course that's going to be more confusing, so I'll stick with name. The other 2 pieces of data we still need to pass down are the phone number and the email. So finish up the first contact first by adding a phone and email prop, and then I want you to fill out all the data for the remaining 3 contacts with the image, name, phone, and email props. All of the data, of course, can still be found here, so you'll have a bit of copying and pasting to do. Pause the screencast and add the rest of our props to our contacts. Okay, hopefully that wasn't too painful for you, and hopefully you got a good sense of what it's like to add props to React components. I'll finish up this first contact together, and then I'll probably skip over the rest. So let's add a phone prop here. I can just come down and copy Mr. Whiskerson's phone number, and we'll add an email prop as well, and we'll copy this as well. Now, I'm going to go ahead and finish up these contacts, but I'll skip over that so you don't have to watch me monotonously copying and pasting the data from below. Okay, that wasn't so bad, was it? At this point, I can come down and get rid of this old version that we have here, just to clean things up a little bit. I'll also clean up our challenge. And at this point, you probably can see that things are a lot more organized. Sure, we still have a good number of lines of code here, but the data is the primary focus. We can see exactly what data we're passing into our contact component, and then our contact component contains the specific display logic on how the data should be used. Of course, at this point, we haven't made any changes to the contact component. So if I hit refresh, what do you think will happen? Well, hitting refresh won't change anything. We're still going to have 4 instances of Mr. Whiskerson, because essentially what we have now is a function like our add to numbers that takes parameters A and B, but still is returning hard-coded data. So even if we call add to numbers, or let's say, let's call this numbers, and we pass in 5 and 10, it doesn't really matter at this point that we're passing in 5 and 10 because the body of the function is still returning hard-coded numbers. So in the next screencast, let's see how we can make use of the properties that will be passed into this component so we can get back to a place where we have our 4 different instances of our contact card. In the last lesson, we learned about how to pass values into our components using a very similar syntax that we're already used to with attributes in HTML. In React, we don't call these attributes, we actually call them properties, or usually for short, just props. Unfortunately, it's very easy to get the data that we're passing into our components inside of our component itself. Right here, just like a function that takes parameters, I'm going to put the word props. In truth, I could call this whatever I want. In fact, I'll show you exactly what happens. I'm going to console log what we called whatever. And let me make a little room here, open the console, and hit save. Now, 4 things got logged to the console. I want you to think for a second, why did it console log 4 times? It console logged 4 times because I have 4 contact instances. Every time React rendered one of my contacts, it ran the console log line inside of the code of that component. And if you look closely, you'll see that we have 4 properties in that console. Let me copy one of them out here so I can actually reference it. We got 4 properties here. If I clean these up each onto their own line, you can see that what we received, what we're calling whatever, is an object that has properties that match exactly with what we put here as our prop inside of the component here. Let's see what happens if I maybe change img to something like the whole word of image. Again, I can change these to whatever I want them to be. So now when I hit save, if you look down below, the first item is receiving an object that now has an image property all spelled out, whereas all the other ones are still receiving an img property. Anyway, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much, so let's come up here and change whatever to props, because props is what you'll usually be calling this. And at this point, I want you to pause the screencast and see if you can figure out how to use this object that has all of the properties we want to update our component. This one's going to take some critical thinking, but I want you to really think through it, see if you can figure out how to essentially make it so that our components are not 4 instances of Mr. Whiskerson, but rather have the correct data and images displaying here. Let me type that out as a real challenge. Okay, there's your challenge. Pause the screencast and see if you can make it so that essentially we finish this little contact book where each one is its own separate contact. Pause now and work on this challenge. Well, if props is an object and I can access the values of that object by using props dot, for example, name, props.image, then all I really should have to do is update this hard-coded data, for example, the name here, to curly braces props.name. Of course, if I didn't put the curly braces in there, it would literally interpret the text props.name, and then all of the names would say props.name when I surround it with curly braces. Awesome. My names are changing. Obviously, nothing else has changed. So let's go ahead and do the rest. I'll start with these easy ones. We'll get props.phone and props.email. Okay, the phone and email are coming through correctly. Now the image. This one may have been a little bit trickier for you, but simply all I'd have to do is erase the entire source, including the quotation marks, and put my JavaScript here. Because the value that's coming in through props.image, or img, is already a string, it's going to fill in the string value for my source. I hit save, and there's all of my values. But here's a bug. I introduced this when I was teaching the concept. Hopefully this was a good chance for you to do some debugging. If you didn't, I want you to see if you can figure out why the picture for Mr. Whiskerson is not coming in. Pause the screencast and try to fix this bug. Well, right here for our image source, we're assuming that we're receiving a prop called img. Back in app.js, however, I did change this to image. So I'll change this back to img, hit save, and now the photo for Mr. Whiskerson is coming in just fine. Now, I hope I'm not belaboring the point. Understanding props is one of the most crucial things that you can do in React when you're learning. So yes, we've spent a lot of time covering props. However, you will use props every single day of your React life. So this is a really big milestone. If you feel like you've understood everything in React that we've talked about so far, you should really congratulate yourself, pat yourself on the back, and probably at this point, take a little break. Don't try to bite off too much more than you can chew. And I do want to show you a little cool trick that we can do with our props here in the next screencast. Okay, it's time to give you a prop quiz. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Like before, your task is to read through each of these questions, to actually click into the editor and type down your answers. Don't forget, in Scrimba, if you have any changes that you make to the code, you can always save it as a note so that you have access to it later. You can even record your own voice talking over the top of the note if you wanted to keep an audio note. And all of those are saved here in your account on Scrimba. So pause now, answer the questions through this quiz, and then you can hit play and we'll go through the quiz together. Number 1, what do props help us accomplish? Well, just like parameters being passed into a function, props being passed into a component help us make that component more reusable. As you become more and more experienced in React, you'll realize that there are times when it makes a lot of sense to pass props into a component so that it's reusable, and other times when it might be possible to pass props into a component, but it's just not always necessary. I can't tell you how much time I have spent trying to create a component that's very reusable and then ended up only using it 1, maybe 2 times. That's just one of those things that will come with experience as you write more and more React code. Remember, when we pass props into a component, it could be data that actually gets displayed as a part of that component, or it could sort of be like metadata that you're passing into the component that in a way configures it to act a certain way. Either way, it helps us make any component that we create more reusable so that we can keep our code as dry as possible. Okay, so number 2, how do you pass a prop into a component? In the same way that you pass attributes to HTML elements, like a source attribute for an image, you essentially do the same thing when you're passing props to a component. So if I have my own component like, let's say, my awesome header, I'm using a strange name just to make it very clear that this is a custom one. You can pass a prop of your own choosing, like maybe title, into that component. That brings us to number 3. Can I pass a custom prop, like, for example, blah, 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 to a native DOM element? So, for example, a div with a lowercase d. Well, the answer is no. So we come to the next part, why not? And that's because under the hood, when React sees a regular HTML element that we're trying to render, we express that element through the JSX syntax, and that JSX syntax actually returns an object, and the object describes the actual DOM node that should be created. When we add an attribute to a regular DOM element like a lowercase d div, the object that this JSX creates is expecting to be able to add this property to the DOM element. And since DOM elements don't have an attribute called blah, 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 I can't just choose the props that I want to add to native DOM elements like this div. So let me try typing out a summary of that. So the answer is no, because the JSX that we use to describe those native DOM elements we want React to create will eventually be turned into real DOM elements, and real DOM elements don't have whatever properties, let's say properties, or attributes specified in the HTML specification, which, as we all know, doesn't include properties like blah, blah, blah. Okay, I think we understand that concept. How do I receive props in a component? Simply enough, the parameters to that component function will receive a value called props, which of course we could name whatever we want, but by very strong convention will be props. And that leads us to the last question, which is what data type is props in the component when I receive it? This parameter, which we're calling props, is an object, which means if I want to access the properties of that object, I use dot syntax. So props dot whatever the prop was that I passed in. Let's use blah, 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 because that's what we said before. Okay, awesome job on that quiz. If you struggled with any of these questions, of course, don't hesitate to go back and review the things that we've recently learned. And when you're ready, let's move on. At this point in the course, you should be somewhat familiar with the concept of object destructuring. However, just in case, we'll do a quick recap. Say I have an object called person. In ES6 and later, I can destructure the properties of that object in order to get simpler to use variable names. For example, if I wanted to log person.phone, I obviously could just use console log person.phone and everything would work just fine. However, in certain circumstances, it can be nice to destructure this object and pull out the property names for your own use. That looks kind of like this. I might say const, and then I'll use an object syntax, say image, comma, name, and then set that equal to person, my object. What that does is it declares two new variables, img and name, which I can then use in order to, say, console log the name. If I open the console, you can see I'm getting Mr. Whiskerson here. So that's the concept of object destructuring. The reason I bring that up is that it's a fairly common thing to do this in React with the incoming props that you receive. The parameter that you put inside of your component will be an object that represents all of the props that your component received. So what I could decide to do is just destructure that object immediately as I receive it inside of my function here, which means that I could say curly braces, image, name, phone, and email. It's important to note that I can't rename this to something else like image unless I do a little bit of trickery using colons, like image, colon, image. But we're not going to be too concerned about that for now. The point being, I don't get to change the name of the prop while I'm bringing it in. I need to make sure that it's exactly as the prop was being passed in at the time that the component was being rendered. If I decide to destructure my object like this, then I will need to change some of my code here. You can see if I refresh, suddenly I get an error that says props is not defined. So let me give you a challenge to fix it. Okay, your challenge is to fix our bug now that we've destructured the props object. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Well, by destructuring our props, we're essentially declaring four new variables up here: image, name, phone, and email. So instead of props.image, I can just reference image and name and phone and email. I hit save and everything should be back to normal. Yep, there we go. The main reason I wanted to show this is just because you will certainly run into React code that either has the full object of props written here, or very commonly the destructured object, which pulls out each of the individual components, or rather properties, of the props object. Frankly, you can write it either way. In my own personal experience, I've experimented with both ways, and in the end, I've found it a little bit easier, in my opinion, to put the props object here and then reference props.image and name and so forth. The only reason being, if I decide to declare other variables inside of my component, let's say right here, it becomes less apparent which variables came in as props and which ones were declared inside of my component. So that's my reasoning for usually sticking to putting the whole props object. It does cause a little bit more of the clutter here by having props dot everywhere, but honestly, that's okay with me. Whichever way you choose, just try to be consistent with it. There certainly are other things that we will learn about props as we go forward, but now it's time for you to get your hands on the keyboard and start practicing the things that we've learned about props. Well, it's been a minute since we've started a new React app totally from scratch. So one last time, I promise the last time I'm going to make you do this, I want you to set up a React app completely from scratch. I guess as a reminder, Scrimba is doing a little bit of magic for us. When we pull in these dependencies, it's setting up our React app basically for us, but I just mean in the coding part. I want you to get a little more practice on doing that from scratch. You can read through the challenge for the specifics on what you're supposed to do. There's also some extra credit down here that would be worth looking into if you're interested and if you were able to do this top part all by yourself. And although I would like you to include your own favorite jokes and maybe share it on Twitter or in Discord, I did include some jokes for you to use just in case you didn't have any jokes on hand that you knew of. So pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Since we've done this a number of times, I am going to move through this fairly quickly. So I'm going to import React from React and import React DOM from React-DOM. We're going to use React DOM to render an app component, which I haven't yet created, but will in just a second. And we'll render it to that div with the ID of root. I'll also import an app component, which isn't yet created, so I will create a new file called app.js. Inside of app.js, again, I'll import React from React. Anytime we need JSX in our code, then I'm going to import React. And I will export my component. For now, I'll just do a quick sanity check. We'll do an H1 that says hi. Okay, good. We're showing up on the screen. You might notice too, I included some basic styling. I changed the font just to switch things up a little bit. Okay, and then it says to have the app component render 4 or 5 joke components. So I will kind of work backwards. We'll have this return a div that surrounds our 5 joke components. And those don't exist, so first I need to import them from a file called joke. And then I need to actually create that file. So in joke.js, again, import React from React, export default our joke component. Okay, we'll have this return a little sanity check H1 for us. Joke here. Hit save. Okay, our 5 joke components are being rendered correctly and showing up on the screen. Now, if you did struggle at any point in just this part of the setup, I really recommend that you just go back, spend the additional time you need to revisit what we've talked about so far. Everything here should not be confusing at this point in the course, and if it is, it's okay. You just probably should go back and revisit some of the stuff that we've learned already. Okay, now comes the practice for actually using our props. We know that we need a setup prop, and I actually copied these already, so I'm just going to paste in the setups for these jokes. And then we have a punchline. Now I can tell that my punchline is going to make each of these a little bit too long. So while I'm here, I'm going to put these on their own lines. Okay, and then I have all the punchlines copied as well. Now think for a second. I haven't hit save yet. Think for a second, what is going to change, if anything, on my screen here? If you said nothing's going to change, then you're right. And that's because I am passing props in, but my component is not making use of them at all. So let's do that. I'm going to receive the props. Just for giggles, let's take a look at what console logs when I console log these props. We see we get 5 instances of the props object. So really quick question. If I typed console log 1 time, how come I'm getting 5 console logs? Well, just like any function, whenever I run it, it will run this console log. And in our case, because we have 5 instances of a joke component, it's running this joke function 5 times. Now, because props is an object, I can access the setup and the punchline through dot syntax. I can say props.setup and props.punchline. Let's make this not an H1, but a div. And I don't know, let's make these H3s maybe. And I'll separate each one with a little horizontal rule. Now, here's another check for you. If you weren't able to get to this point, I want you to think now, how am I going to actually make my setup and my punchline display on the screen? In fact, you can pause here and actually make that happen. Well, I can't just say props.setup because, of course, that will make it literally put the text props.setup on the screen. To insert our JavaScript value inside of my JSX, I just need to wrap it in curly braces. I'll do the same thing here. We'll say props.punchline. And I need to make sure I spell that right. And let's hit save. And awesome, we get everything showing up. Now, one thing I just thought of, I might want to change this to something like a paragraph just to change the boldness between these two or give it a little bit of contrast between the setup and the punchline. And I think that that hits all of the points from our original challenge here. Go ahead and delete this. Now we come to the extra credit. And if you were able to complete this extra credit, then you're pretty far ahead because we haven't yet taught things like conditional rendering. But I did think that I would just give you a little sneak peek on it. So here's an example of one of my favorite jokes that's just a one-liner here. Over in app.js, I'm going to create another instance of a joke, and I'll put it at the top so we can see it more readily. Now, in this case, there really isn't a setup for this one. It's just a punchline. So what's going to happen if I just include a punchline? Well, we can see that I really don't have anything being rendered up above here. However, if we did go into the dev tools, we would see that up above this paragraph, there's actually an empty H3 sitting up here. Honestly, it's not that big of a deal the way we currently have things set up. But what if I went to my joke and instead of just putting the setup and the punchline, I said something like setup, and punchline, Now when I hit refresh, we can see that, well, it's a little bit broken here. Again, this isn't something that we've taught, so I didn't necessarily expect you to fully grasp this concept quite yet. But as an advanced sneak peek into conditional rendering, something that I can do is actually only render this H3 if props.setup exists. One really concise way that we're going to learn about is to surround my JSX in curly braces, which means that I'm putting it inside of a JavaScript interpretation. And then I can say props.setup and this H3. We're going to learn about how a lot of the neat little tricks that we can do with React are just using vanilla JavaScript principles. And this is a good example of that. This is saying that if props.setup is a truthy value, then render the thing on the right side of my and operator here. If it's a falsy value, however, it won't render anything at all. So I can hit save and it will look very similar to the way that it looked before. Again, we're going to talk more in depth about that. It doesn't need to make perfect sense quite yet. And one of the cool things about this is we could decide to do it in another way. For example, what if instead of conditionally rendering it this way, I decided to say, well, the style of this H3 is that it has a display of none when props.setup does not exist. Well, I could do that with something like a ternary. I could say the display, if props.setup does exist, then I want it to be block, but otherwise I want it to be none. Obviously, this is a much more convoluted way than what we just saw, but it essentially accomplishes the same thing. The point is we can use those props and vanilla JavaScript principles like a ternary operator or this more concise and operator to accomplish our goals. I'm hoping this was a helpful practice. I'm really looking forward to seeing people's best jokes. And when you're ready, there's still one more little thing we're going to learn about props before we can finally take all of this and apply it to our section project. Okay, I'm sorry that we're still here on the jokes, but I realize there's one more thing we need to cover before we jump back into our section project. And that is, how can we pass a prop that is not just a string? The concept of props, like we talked about, is very similar to the concept of attributes in HTML. And with HTML, we always pass in a string as our data type here. However, we are not limited by that in React. So far, we've only done strings. However, because this is JavaScript, it's React, which is JavaScript, we can pass in any JavaScript data type to our components as props. So I want you to think critically here. How might you pass in a prop that wasn't a string data type? Let's say, for example, you want a number passed to each one of these jokes that eventually will represent the number of upvotes and downvotes for this joke. Or maybe you want to pass in an array of comment objects. And then you might say, I want to allow people to filter out the puns or only show the puns in my jokes, in which case I might pass a prop called isPun, which is the value true or false, not the string true or false, but the actual Boolean value true or false. Accomplishing this uses something that you've already learned at this point. And so I want you to try and think critically. See if you can figure out how you would pass in a non-string value as the prop to your component. And be curious with it, play with it. Actually give it a try, don't just think about it. Pause here and see if you can figure that out. We learned previously that we can jump back and forth between JavaScript and JSX by using curly braces, and the same thing works with our props. For example, these 3 jokes here are all puns. So if I wanted to indicate that, I could say isPun equals, and then jump into JavaScript and send in a Boolean value like true. And then I can do the same thing for these others. And then of course, for the ones that are not puns, I can change this to the JavaScript value, Boolean value of false. And then do the same thing for my jokes up here up top. Actually, I'm struggling now to think if this joke is a pun or not. This might be a pun because it's talking about puns. Anyway, you get the point. By introducing these curly brackets, I can put any JavaScript value in here. So again, if I wanted to pass in a number, I could say upvotes is 10, downvotes is 2. And if I had an array of comments, I could say comments equals, and then this can get as complicated as I want. I can say an array of objects, and maybe those objects have an author property, and it's got some author ID, and then the body of the comment itself, and then maybe there's even a title to the comment and whatnot. Of course, it's an array, so it could be multiples of those and so forth. I can even put JavaScript expressions in here to determine what the value being passed into the props should be. That's getting a little bit more advanced than I want to jump into now, but the point is these curly braces essentially give us free rein to throw any JavaScript we want inside of the curly braces, and whatever that JavaScript expression resolves to is the value that the prop will pass down to our component. So let me fix my syntax error here and go over to my joke component, and let's just console log props.isPun, and you'll see we get a bunch of Boolean values. I could even do props.comments.title, and actually that's going to cause an error because I didn't pass a comments prop to all of them, but let's do props.comments, and we'll see we get a bunch of undefines, but one of them has an array of objects. So I think you get the point. That's going to help us as we go back to our Airbnb experiences clone. So that's what we're finally going to jump back into now. Okay, we're finally back to our Airbnb experiences clone. Your challenge is to pass these props that I've outlined here into our card component, and then inside of our card component, receive those props and make use of them. As a little bit of a hint and a heads up, there's a couple instances that we're not passing in strings, or strings that we are passing in that we need to slightly modify in order for them to work. I guess so that's not too cryptic, the image that we're passing in here, you'll notice, is only the title of the image file. It doesn't include any path to the image itself. The astute of you might know that what we're doing here still is requiring us to hardcode data into our component, and in the real world, that's not what we're going to do. However, we haven't quite gotten there yet. In an upcoming lesson very soon, we're going to see a way that this would actually be structured a little more realistically. But I want to get your hands on the keyboard practicing, like I always say. So work on this challenge until you can show our card component looking essentially exactly the way it is now, but without the hard-coded data inside of the card itself. Pause here and start on that. Okay, I already know that I'm going to have too many props to put on one line, so I'm just going to start them on the next line. And we'll set the image equal to this string. I'm going to copy and paste these just so I don't make a fool of myself making a typing error. The rating is going to be 5.0. Now, this is a string right now. I suppose if we were ever planning on doing math on this rating, then it might be sensible to change it into a floating point number here by surrounding it with curly braces like that. I'm not going to be too concerned about it at this point. the review count, maybe just for good measure, and because I didn't put quotes around the 6 up here, I'll send in a number. The country will say USA, mostly because Katie Zafiris is from the USA. For the title, we'll once again copy this. And the price I'm going to send in as a number. We'll say 136. In this case, I don't think it makes a huge difference because I'm not going to be doing any math on this number probably, but what the heck, just for good practice. Okay, I can clean up this challenge, but I do need to now go to my card component. And the very first thing I should do is actually receive props here. And maybe just so I'm not flipping back and forth between the files to see which props I sent in, I'm going to console log the props so that I can see them down in my console. And that will give me a chance to actually look at the properties that I sent in. Now, right away, we run into a little bit of a challenge. Like I mentioned, we're only passing in the file name and extension. We're not passing in the whole path. But I can't just do string concatenation like saying ... / images / and then plus my props .image, because this plus is not going to make sense. Now I could do that by surrounding this entire thing here in curly braces, but I'm going to make use of the ES6 templating string syntax with these backticks, and that way I can put my $ curly braces. Now this is probably starting to get confusing. Inside of a template string, I can insert values by using $ curly braces, and that's where my props.image will go. However, I can't just put backticks surrounding everything here because that doesn't make sense in JSX. Now this is the tricky part. If I surround the backticks because they are a JavaScript expression in curly braces, then suddenly this expression makes sense. I think this is probably the trickiest part of this challenge. I'm hoping it didn't frustrate anyone too much, but I totally understand if it did because it's a confusing back and forth. Remember, up here we're in JavaScript, then we jump into JSX, then with the curly braces we jump back into JavaScript, and that's why I can use my backticks. Inside of JavaScript and inside template strings, I can use the $ curly braces to insert JavaScript values into this string. I think it's called interpolation. I end my backtick and then I get out of JavaScript and I jump back into JSX. Hopefully you could follow all that. I understand if that's confusing. The rest of this should be really pretty straightforward. My rating is right here. Instead of putting a hard-coded 5.0, I can put my curly braces, props.rating. Instead of my 6, and I'm actually going to just put in my curly braces inside of my parentheses here, I'm going to put props.review count. Again, the parenthesis is still part of JSX and therefore will be interpreted as text. The curly brace gets me into JavaScript, which is why I can then put my JavaScript value, and then I get out of JavaScript and I have my second parentheses to surround it. My country, I can put props.country. In this paragraph, we'll put props.title. And right here for the number, I'm going to leave the $ because I still want that to exist. However, the price that I'm passing in is just the number 136. So I will put props.price. Okay, moment of truth. Let me get us a little extra working room here. I'll hit refresh, and awesome. Everything looks like it is still working the same. Now, it does kind of look like we don't have this space showing up after our dot, but we won't be too concerned about that right now. Okay, last thing, I'm going to clean up my console log up here. And excellent. We now have a reusable component as long as every time I create an instance of my card, I pass in these props. I should be able to get different cards showing up in my list. Really great work. If you were able to follow along with this entire lesson, I really hope that this has been helpful. And hopefully you are just as excited as I am to learn this, because this is giving us more tools in our tool belt, more power for us to create really awesome web applications in React. We obviously have a lot more to learn, but really at this point you should be really excited for everything that you've learned, especially if you're understanding it. If you are feeling lost, of course, as always, go back, revisit these, and ask lots of questions in Discord. Coming up, we're going to be addressing that issue where currently we are still hard coding this data into our code here. And so that's the next topic we're going to tackle. This is a total spoiler alert into what we're about to learn with React, and that is how to use the .map method to take regular JavaScript data and turn it into JSX elements that React can render. So I figured at this point it would be a great opportunity to revisit the map method just in case it's been a while since you've used it, or especially if you never really understood it in the first place. If you fall into that latter group, then I highly recommend you go check out the MDN docs on map, look through the examples, play with the code, and work with it until you at least grasp a basic understanding of the syntax for it. Because you should already know .map by now, I'm going to assume that that's the case, and we're going to work through these challenges. Instead of having you do all of the challenges right away at once, I'm going to let you do challenge number 1, and then we'll go over it together, and then I'll have you do challenge 2, we'll go over it together, and then challenge 3, we'll go over it together. So, of course, we'll start at the beginning with challenge 1, pause the screencast, and work on this challenge. So as a refresher, map is a method on every array. Because I've declared nums to be an array, nums has a method called .map. .map is a higher order method, which means that it takes a function as its main parameter. This is a great example of a method that is declarative, because under the hood, .map is going to handle the regular for loop for us, and all we need to do is provide a function that the map method can use to run on every single item inside of the array. Whatever we return from this function, as part of our return here, is what will get placed in the same index in a brand new array. And in the end, nums.map is going to return a new array, so I need to save that array in a variable. We'll say const squared equals the array that gets returned from nums.map. An important part of this is that the function I provide to .map is going to receive each of the items in the array one at a time as .map loops over the array for us and runs this function. So if I were to, for example, console log item, I would see that I get each of the original items in the array, and they each show up on their own line because this console log is running 5 separate times. So all we have to do is simply return item squared. I could use the math library, or I could just say item times item. And now if I console log squared, I should get this array, which was my original goal. And sure enough, there it is. Okay, that was just to get our feet wet. This next one has a little bit extra challenge, includes potentially some string methods, but again, it's just a regular JavaScript challenge. Pause the screencast and work on challenge number 2. Okay, just like before, we'll create a variable to hold our destination array, or our returned array. Let's call it uppercase, and we'll get that by using names.map. Now above I used a function declaration like this, but this time I'm going to use an arrow function just to simplify my code a little bit. It's essentially the same. I can open it up and use return. I'll fix this later for anybody that's yelling at me that I can simplify this even more. And inside my function, I'm going to be receiving an item. Now I could call it item, or I think a little more intuitively, I'll call it a name. In fact, usually I would call this item probably num or number. Let's call it num just to kind of clean that up, make it obvious what we're working with. Now with the name, what I want to return is the first letter capitalized in that string. Now I'll be totally honest, string methods are not something I usually just have memorized. I usually end up looking them up. I'm gonna wing this and see how it works. Essentially what I'm trying to return is the first index, so I'll say name at the index of 0 dot to uppercase. And that should be a string of the first letter that's now capitalized, and then I'm going to add name dot, I think slice will do it, and I'll start at the index of 1, which I think will give me the rest of the name starting at index 1 inclusive. Again, this is kind of a shot in the dark, so we'll see how this goes. Console log uppercase. And oh, I was so close. I think I just need to add my parentheses here. Awesome. I probably could have done something like name.slice 0, 1 maybe, and then change that to uppercase. I also could have done something a little more complex, like surrounding these in template strings and then using interpolation to figure that out. And that might help me get rid of my plus. Now I'm just kind of playing around. Nope, there's my space. I don't need a space. Okay, that to me is a lot less readable than what I had before, so I'm going to keep it this way. I guess that's one of the fun things about these challenges. You can try to solve it in multiple different ways. Okay, let's clean this up. I'm going to comment this out, and I'll send you now to challenge number 3. Just to clarify, because we're just working in regular JavaScript here, I'm not expecting this to work in React or JSX or anything. Essentially, all we're doing is taking this string and then adding what looks like paragraph tags, the opening and closing tags, on the beginning and the end of that string. Of course, this is leading to a point that will then take us to React. Pause the lesson here and start working on challenge number 3. Okay, let's say maybe const elements, even though these aren't real elements. And that's going to be pokemon.map. I'll use my arrow function again, and this time because I'm only going to be using a single parameter, let's see, I think Pokemon is both singular and plural, right? Maybe I'll say mon for monster. Because I only have a single parameter, I can get rid of those parentheses and just put my arrow here. And, well, before I simplify the rest, let me actually open this up and we'll do it the way we did it before, and then we'll clean it up. Now, this time around, I think it probably will be easier to use a template string, so I'm going to put my paragraph text here, and then inside of my paragraph text, I will put my monster's name. Let's console log elements, make sure that this is going to look the way we expect, and awesome, that looks great. Now, regarding cleaning things up, because an arrow function has the ability to have an implicit return, if I start that return on the same line as the arrow, I can clean this up that way. I can also do the same up here, get rid of my explicit return, make it implicit, and because I only have one parameter, I can get rid of those parentheses. If you're still feeling hazy with arrow functions, don't worry, I'm kind of with you there. But once you do get used to them, they can really provide a nice, simple syntax for you to perform operations that otherwise might take a number of lines of code. That's another one of the benefits, like I mentioned, of having declarative methods like .map. It's handling the for loop for us. We simply have to follow the rules, and we get back exactly what we expect. Now, again, what we're ending with here looks like an array of HTML elements. In fact, if we were to be doing regular DOM manipulation, we probably could use these using the inner HTML method to have the browser actually turn these element strings or DOM strings into real HTML elements on the screen. But since we're not doing that and we're doing React, we're going to see how we can basically use this exact same principle to take data from an array and turn it into JSX elements that get displayed on our screen. There's one more really small step that I want to cover before we get there, so let's cover that next. I think now is probably a good time to remember that JSX just returns a regular JavaScript object. We can see that if I were to set, let's say, a new variable called element equal to some JSX, and we'll say just an h1. And then if I console log element, what we actually get back is just a plain old JavaScript object. The properties and the shape of this object get determined by React in order to describe the element that React eventually will be turning into a real DOM node that shows up on our screen. But the reason that I mention this is because when you get deeper and deeper into web development, and actually programming in general, you'll discover that most arrays don't end up being an array of simple strings like we sometimes use for examples like this. Instead, it's probably most common to find arrays end up being an array of objects. Let's keep this example simple. We'll say it's a first name and a last name in this object. That's because data is usually a lot more complicated than just what can be represented by a simple string, and so we use objects to represent pieces of data in a lot more detail. Well, there's a little special feature of React, and that is that if we provide an array into what we're rendering from our component, React will know how to essentially map over that array and turn it into elements. Let me clean some of this up and show you a little bit more what I mean. Let's say we create this array of colors, and I'm just going to put in the colors of the rainbow. Of course, I just got done mentioning that usually we don't have an array of strings, but this is just to illustrate a point. Inside of my return, when I'm returning the elements that I actually want to put on the page, I can give React this array and let it render it to the page. Now, I can't just say colors because then it's going to put the actual word colors on there. So I'll surround it in curly braces. And now essentially what it's going to do is copy this. Basically, I could have just done this in its place. So we'll take this one step at a time. Let's look at it this way. Now, obviously this is not beautiful, and we can tell already that it's essentially just putting these together as blank text. I haven't taught React that I want these to be paragraphs or headers or ordered lists or anything like that. Now, of course, if I do want to use my variable colors up here, I can essentially just put colors here, and I still, of course, need my curly braces here. When I hit save, I get the same result. But now I want you to do a little challenge to experiment with what will happen if you change these from strings into JSX elements. Okay, simple enough. I just want you to essentially change these strings into JSX elements, and I said H3. You can do whatever element you want. Then I want to make sure that you hit save or refresh and see exactly how what we have currently changes when you do that. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Okay, maybe this is getting into the realm of busy work, but let me do this really quick. Okay, let's see what happens when I hit save. Awesome. Now I actually got a list of JSX elements that are being displayed as H3s. In some ways, it's kind of like React took the elements here and just copied and pasted them onto the screen. Of course, I would need to get rid of all these commas for that to work correctly, but I get the same result this way. But let's put it back to colors so that it works the way it's supposed to work. Okay, now we are poised to take what we just talked about and reviewed with .map and what we just learned about where React can render an array of JSX elements and put those concepts together, which will allow us to, instead of hard coding our data directly into our components like we're doing here, instead we can get data from outside of our little system, map over it, and render a new component for every piece of data. In other words, in the next screencast, we're going to see a jokes.js file, which has essentially the same thing, but in a JavaScript array of objects. Then we'll get to pull those in and map over them, create an array of JSX elements, and then render those to the screen. So when you're feeling ready, let's go forward. Let me walk you through a couple of changes I made to the code that we were just looking at. Of course, you probably noticed I moved all of our hard-coded joke components outside of our component here and just commented them out so we can still reference them. I've also changed our jokes.markdown file into a jokesdata.javascript file. Now, we're not quite ready to make API calls and then make use of the data that comes back, so I'm going to be kind of mimicking that with this jokes.js file that's exporting an array of these joke objects. Over in our app.js, I'm going to import the jokes, I'll say jokes data, from that file, /jokes_data. And we can see that if I console log jokes data, I should get the array of jokes. Okay, great. Now combining what we just learned with .map and with creating an array of JSX elements, I can put those two concepts together. What I'm going to do is create a variable, let's call it joke elements. And this is going to be not an array that I'm defining right now, but instead the array that gets returned when I call jokesdata.map. Inside of my .map, I'm going to take a look at each one of my joke objects, and what I can return, I'll do this on its own line just so we can see a little more clearly what's happening. I'm going to return a joke component. However, I can pass the data from this individual joke object to my joke component. So maybe this is a good opportunity for you to put on your thinking cap and do a quick little challenge. Your challenge is to see if you can pass the props to our joke component in the correct way, and then of course render our joke elements array so that when you're all done, all of our jokes show up on the page again. Pause the screencast and see if you can complete this challenge. Each of the joke objects that I am looking at inside of my .map is each of these objects that we see here. So they have a setup property and a punchline property, which means over here I can say my joke has a setup prop, and this has to be spelled exactly this way because our joke component is expecting props.setup. This setup prop will be equal to, and then I need to use my curly braces because I'm leaving JSX and going into JavaScript. We'll say joke.setup. Now it just so happens that I'm using the same name for the prop that I'm passing to my joke component, props.setup, and the object property that I chose in my actual data setup here. However, it's not always going to be the case that these are the same. If, for example, these were question instead, then over in app.js, I would still say setup because I'm the one that gets to choose what the prop name for my component is, but then my actual data would need to change to joke.question. Now, a question doesn't always make sense in this case because they're not all questions, but hopefully that illustrated a point. And next I will need my punchline, and this is going to be joke.punchline. Again, because the actual data has a punchline property in each of these joke objects. Now I'm not quite done. I can hit save. Nothing's going to show up on the screen, and that's because I'm still returning an empty div in my app component. The last thing I need is just to render my joke elements, hit save, and there we go. We've got all of our jokes back on the page. Now, if I clean some of this up, you can see just how much simpler this makes our lives as React developers. And then if I were being really stingy, I could use the implicit return to just return my joke element. I'm not going to worry too much about that, especially because it makes it a little too wide horizontally there. Awesome. Okay, we have taken a number of asides. Once again, I'm going to bring us back to our Airbnb experiences clone, and we're going to take this concept and actually build the separate experiences in their own cards. This time using data that we get from a file instead of hard coding things into our code. Make sure you have studied this and understand it before you move on, and when you're ready, let's jump back into our section project. All right, it's time for another quiz. We're going to look at the .map array method, read through these questions, click into the editor, type down your answers, and when you're ready, click play and we'll go through the quiz together. Number 1, what does the map array method do? And I'm referring here to JavaScript in general, not specifically React. Well, the array map method takes a function as its parameter, and whatever gets returned from that function will be placed in the same index of a brand new array. So maybe let's say it returns a new array, and whatever gets returned from the callback function provided is placed at the same index in the new array. And well, yeah, that's good enough. Theoretically speaking, our callback function, we could just hard code something like return the string hello, and then we would have an array filled with hellos. But usually what we're trying to do is take items from the original array and modify them in some way. In fact, maybe I'll type that down. With that in mind, number 2 asks, what do we usually use .map for in React? Well, in web applications, it's really common for us to have an array of raw data, usually an array of objects, and to want to turn that array of data into something that's visible on the screen. So in React, we'll take an array of data, we'll map over it, and turn each of those items into some kind of JSX element that gets put on the page. So more concisely, it allows us to convert an array of raw data into an array of JSX elements that can be displayed on the page. And number 3, why is using .map better than just creating the components manually by typing them out and putting the props in that we want? Using .map in this way is a lot more dry. Obviously, if you think in terms of something like Amazon, every time a new product is uploaded to Amazon and Amazon sells that product, there isn't a developer out there who's going to go copy and paste the elements from a product and then put in different props, let's say. No, instead, the data will change, and using something like .map will automatically convert that raw data into something that gets displayed on the page. One way you could put it, like I wrote here, is that it makes our code more self-sustaining in a way, meaning that it doesn't require additional changes whenever the data also changes. It makes me think of when we're typing out a C-style for loop and we say something like for, let I equal 0, and then we use I is less than some array dot length. This makes it so that if the length of the array ever were to change, our for loop would not require intervention. Instead, it would automatically check the length of the array, and that's what it uses in this parameter in the for loop. Alternatively, if I just said something like I is less than 5, but I'm looking through the elements of an array that maybe now has, let's say, 10 elements in it, my for loop is broken and it requires intervention from a programmer. I think you probably understand, so I'm just going to erase this for loop and leave it where it is. Awesome work on this quiz. Hopefully you were able to answer all of these questions. When you're ready, let's move on and start applying what we just learned to our section project. I am coming to you from the future again because in the next challenge, for anybody who is following along using Create React App on their local machine instead of following along here in Scrimba, the upcoming challenge might throw you for a bit of a loop, technically speaking. What we're about to do is go back to the Airbnb project and use a data file that includes links to the local images so that you can map over it and display those images as well as the other pieces of data. And you'll see that just kind of works out of the box here in Scrimba. But if you're following along with Create React App, you'll get something that looks more or less like this. Obviously, this is not ideal. The last time that I spoke to using Create React App, I mentioned how it's gently advised against putting any assets inside of the public directory. However, this is an instance where I'm just going to recommend that you put your images inside of your public directory. I'm going to go to the next slide. This has an animated GIF that might take a minute for some people to load. But you can see that what it's doing is it's taking the images directory from the source folder and moving it up into the public folder. The reason I'm recommending doing this is, well, first of all, normally you're not going to have a data file that includes all of the data you need. Instead, you would actually be getting that data from some online resource. And second of all, because it just magically works. When you move the images to the public folder, things just kind of start working again. So that was just a quick heads up for anybody using Create React App. If you're following along here in Scrimba, you really don't have to worry about any of that for now. Okay, with that said, let's jump in. Okay, it all comes down to this. We are going to put all the things that we just learned together to progress our section project here with the Airbnb Experiences clone. I've written out your task here, and let me walk you through just a couple things. First of all, there's now a data.js file, and this contains an array of the objects that represent the data that we're going to be displaying on the screen. Part of your task is to import that data as it mentions, map over it to create our card components, kind of like we have hard-coded here, and then render that array in place of this card component. One little change that I did make is I changed the country prop to location, and I also made that change in the data here. So in case you were curious about why that's changed, I just decided it made more sense since we might have some online experiences. And another thing is you'll notice there are some properties here that we won't yet be using, like open spots or description. That's okay. For now, just ignore those. We'll decide later if we want to make use of them. Also, as I mentioned in the note here, because we haven't done styling to our group of components or anything like that yet, they're going to stack on top of each other because they're block element divs. For now, that's okay. Don't worry about them being stacked vertically. We'll fix that later. Okay, now is the time. I know that you can do it. You've worked hard up until this point. Hopefully you have studied and rewatched everything you needed to in order to understand what we're doing. So let's jump right in, pause the screencast, and work on the challenge. All right, let's do this. First, I need to import my data, and I probably will just stick with the word data as my variable name here. So we'll say import data from /data. And maybe just before I get too far down the road, I'll console log this just to make sure that I'm getting the data I think I'm getting. Okay, yeah, that looks right. Again, as a quick reminder, usually you won't be importing a hard-coded data file. We'll be covering API calls and how to get data from an online source later. But until we learn a couple more things, we're not going to be able to do anything really except for importing our data. Then down in our component, I don't want to erase this comment because that's my whole hero section that we commented out for space sake before. Let's take our data and, I don't know, maybe call them cards. We'll say cards is equal to data.map, and we'll let map look over each of those experiences. Maybe I'll just call it item for now. And then for each item in that array, I want to return, well, let me just copy this here because it's got all the properties that I want. And then instead of having these hard-coded values, I will just replace them with the values from our object. So let me just make sure that I get all these properties right. We have, this is called cover image, not image. So I guess some of these might change. So that's cover image. Again, this is another instance where the data had a different property than what we chose to call our prop that we're passing into our component. That's entirely okay, and actually ends up being pretty common, especially if you're not thrilled with the way that the data was designed. Oftentimes you're consuming data that someone else has put in their database and you don't get to choose these property names. Okay, our rating. Let's look at our data. Now we have this stats property, and that's where our rating is. So we're going to have item.stats.rating. And similarly with review count, item.stats.review count. So here, item.stats.rating and item.stats.review count. Okay, in the data we have location, that's going to stay the same, so location will just be location, item.location. Title, I believe, was item.title, and this, I believe, was item.price. Let's just double check those. I like to double check them because otherwise I might see missing data and then get really confused about why it's not working. Title, price, title, and price. Okay, now that we have created our array of card components, we need to render it. So let's get rid of our hard-coded card. I'll put curly braces because I need to enter into JavaScript here. My array of JSX elements is still considered JavaScript, so I'm going to put that in curly brackets, say cards, hit save, and look at that. We're getting all of our experiences showing up. Of course, again, they're vertically stacked. Each one has its own unique data being displayed, and awesome. At this point, we have covered a bulk of the material from this section that I wanted to cover. And don't get me wrong, we've covered a lot of things so far. There's a lot here to practice with, and as always, if you're not feeling comfortable yet with some of this material, it's important to stick with it, practice it over and over until you understand it. That being said, we do have a couple more things that I want to cover before we finish off this section. First of all, we need to style this, so we'll do that in the next screencast. And then I want to give you a sneak peek into some of the topics we'll be talking about in the next section. So when you're ready, let's polish off our project here with some CSS. Okay, I've got to be honest with you. I was going to have you style the list of cards here so that they would horizontal scroll inside of a container. But we've already spent a pretty fair amount of time doing CSS inside of React. And so for all the hard work and effort that you have put in so far, I've got a little present for you. Bam, we've got the styling done. Of course, if you're interested to see how I did this, basically I made a flex container, made it so that none of the items would grow or shrink as the container got bigger or smaller, and then just set the overflow to scroll, essentially. You can check the CSS for the details on it. I've also included little tags that will tell you exactly what I added so that you could easily see what actually changed. Also notice that I used a section element here to surround our cards. That allowed me both to give this a class name and give it specific styling, but it also allowed me to make use of our styles that we put way back in the beginning on sections so that it had some padding on the left and right. Now there are two things that I want to talk about here. One is how awesome it is that we are now mapping over our data, because it means that if the data ever changes, our page will automatically update. So if I were to, for example, paste in 3 more items here, I just copied the one and pasted it again. and then updated, our page is going to automatically update with all of the new activities that are included in our data. Clearly, this is a much better way to work as a developer where the data will change and your page doesn't need to. Your code actually stays exactly the same, and all that really updates is how that data is being used to display your elements on the screen. The second thing that I want to cover is this error that we have been seeing, or rather a warning that we've been seeing that says each child in a list should have a unique key prop. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this course to dive deep into why this key prop is necessary, but you will see this warning anytime you are using .map on data to create JSX elements, or rather an array of JSX elements. First, let me go to data.js and get rid of those 3 extra items we had. Now, over on our card, the way we can get rid of this warning is by simply adding a prop called key, and it very specifically needs to be key, K-E-Y. And I need to set key equal to something unique about this individual item. In this case, pretty much everything about these different experiences is unique. The image is different, the title, the price. However, for example, the rating is not different between this first one and the second one, so that's not something I could use as my key because it's not unique. Fortunately, when we're pulling data from a database, almost always we'll receive some kind of ID property that we can guarantee will be unique because the database is creating that as a unique property in the database. Now, obviously, I typed all of this in manually, but I gave it an ID so that we could mimic this concept. Over in app.js, I'm going to assign the key to be item.id. Again, I probably could have used the title or the price for this warning to go away, but when I hit save, we'll see that warning disappears. So those were just a couple of miscellaneous items that I wanted to cover. I'm not going to put our hero back in quite yet because there is one more thing that I want us to talk about, and that touches again on a sneak peek of conditional rendering. And we'll talk about that in the next cast. A phrase you might hear from the React community is that people love React because it's just JavaScript. Now, of course, under the hood, there's things like JSX, which is a little bit of magic being performed by React. But I wanted to show you what that means by giving you another sneak peek at conditional rendering. Now, I've updated the little screenshot that I have here to show you this little badge down here that says sold out. And you might have noticed that in the data, we actually have a property called open spots. Now, I intentionally set this first one to open spots of 0 so that we could conditionally render this little badge if the open spots is ever 0. You might remember from the first time I did a little sneak peek on conditional rendering, the term is referring to when we only will sometimes render a part of our page. Right now, everything on here will render every time this component gets called. However, what we can do is take a look at props, and if props.openspots, let's say, is equal to 0, then we can display the little sold out badge. Otherwise, we just won't display it at all. Now, there's 2 parts that we need to make this work. First of all, over in app.js, we aren't currently passing in the data from OpenSpots into our card component. So the first thing we need to do is create a new prop called OpenSpots, set that equal to item.OpenSpots. Another thing you may have noticed is that we sure are passing a lot of props into this component. We're going to cover a truncated way to essentially do this same thing without having to add a new prop to our card component every time we want some data from our item. But for now, we'll stick with what we know. So we now have a prop called OpenSpots. We're passing in that number value from our data right here. Now in our card.js, let's just make sure that this is working. I'll go ahead and console log props.openspots and check our console. And sure enough, we get 0, 27, and 3 because that's how many open spots there are for each of our experiences. So let me get back to what I meant by it's just JavaScript. First, let's go ahead and actually create a little badge that will float in the upper left of this image. The way I'm going to do that is by setting my card to be position relative and have a div here that's position absolute. Of course, for now, this div will always show up. We'll fix it so that it conditionally renders as soon as we have something that looks good. Let's go ahead and just hard code in sold out, and I will give it a class name. Let's call it card, probably badge. And honestly, just to save time, I'm going to paste some styles in here. so that you don't get too bored. Then on my card, I need to make it position relative, and I need to refresh this. Okay, now obviously it's hard-coded, so every one of these has a sold out badge. And you might remember that the way we handled conditional rendering before was we surrounded our div that we only sometimes want to display in curly braces, and then essentially included a condition beforehand. Now we used a very short version of that condition, which we'll use again. I can say props.openspots equals 0 and the div that I want to render. This is kind of a clever example of how in React we typically use just plain JavaScript to handle things like the display logic that our component needs to know about. If this first statement is truthy, then this second statement, or this JSX element, will run and therefore get displayed. However, if this first statement is falsy, then the second one will actually never even get called or run, and therefore this div will never display on the screen. So if I hit save, we'll see that now I only have a sold out badge on the element that had exactly 0 spots in it. Technically, because 0 is a falsy value, I could say that if not props.openspots, but that's a little less easy for me to read, and if another developer were to come see this, they might expect openspots to be a boolean, and so I'm going to keep it as triple equals 0 to be very explicit. Now, if you actually go look at the Airbnb Experiences website, you'll notice that even in our design here, we talk about online experiences, and some of our locations are online. The actual website itself has a little badge that says online in order to help people understand that it's going to be, well, probably through a Zoom meeting instead of an in-person live meeting. So I thought I'd show you yet another example of how we can use just plain JavaScript to help determine the display logic of our components here. Right now, I have this badge that says sold out. Now, I could come up with something kind of complicated by putting my display logic in here that says if openspots is 0, then display this div. Otherwise, if the location is online, then display another div. Otherwise, display nothing. But as I was preparing this, I came up with another way that I figured was a little more concise. And so I thought I'd show that here. If you've ever done a code challenge on, well, any number of the websites that exist out there that allow you to practice code challenges, this might feel kind of familiar. My goal is to dynamically render not just this entire div, but also the text inside of it. So I'm going to set a variable using let, and I'll say this is badge text. Then I can just use regular JavaScript and say if props.openspots is equal to 0, then I want badge text to read sold out. Or let's put it all in caps to stay consistent. However, if it's not sold out, I also want it to check if props.location is equal to online. And if it is, then we'll have badge text say online. Now there's two things that I need to change with this line of code in order to make it so that primarily if it's sold out, it has a badge that says sold out. Secondarily, if the location is online, it displays a badge that says online, but otherwise it displays no badge at all. In fact, let's make this a challenge for you. Okay, your challenge is to display the correct badge text instead of this hard-coded sold out. And secondly, to only display the badge when it's either sold out or an online experience. I've given you some hints basically in the language that I used for this challenge number 2. Pause the screencast and work on these challenges. Okay, for the first challenge to display the correct text, all we have to do is erase sold out and instead render whatever the value of badge text is. Now, of course, currently this will only get rendered if openspots is exactly equal to 0. So we also need to change our condition upon which this gets rendered. Kind of a clever way that I thought of was, well, when we initiate badge text up here, its value is going to be undefined. And then if props.openspots is 0 or props.location is online, then badge text will have a real value. I can use the truthiness of a real value or the falsiness of undefined to just say if badge text exists, or rather if badge text has a real value, then I want you to display the badge. Now, maybe this is contrary to what I said before about assuming truthy and falsy values. This one seems a little more logical to me, however. So if I hit save, awesome. Now we have sold out on anything that's sold out. Notice even if it's an online experience, it will prefer sold out first because that's our first condition up here. And then if it does have open spots, but it's online, it has an online badge. And if it's neither, then there's just no badge at all. Now we will be covering conditional rendering in more detail later. However, the point that I'm trying to get across is that in React, we very often use plain JavaScript, like this kind of regular algorithmic JavaScript, to determine how things will get displayed on the page. That might not seem unique or strange to you until you've worked in another framework like Angular or I think Vue as well, where there are actually properties built into the markup that you see that provide logic for using for loops or conditional statements and so forth. I'm not necessarily vying for one over the other, but hopefully this sheds some light into why a lot of proponents of React will say they like it because it's just JavaScript. And along those lines, the next thing we're going to do is go clean up this card component that is getting pretty lengthy. We'll do that in the next lesson. When we have a component that's in charge of maybe displaying one or two pieces of data, it's not that big of a deal to pass each of those pieces of data down individually as separate props. However, we can see our card component is starting to get a bit lengthy, and honestly, we haven't even included things like maybe there's a description or a set of tags that can categorize these experiences. Whatever the case might be, along the theme of React being just JavaScript, what we can opt to do instead of passing each of these properties of our data down individually is we can just say, I'm just going to give this component the entire item object. Notice I kept key here. That's because it's something unique that we need to include anytime we're using map. But for all the other properties of data that I need my card to know about, I'm just going to pass the entire item object down. Of course, because I'm changing the structure of my card, over here, when I hit save, well, everything is broken now. But if at this point you truly have an understanding of how props works and how the things that we pass down to our components can get received by the component, you should be able to complete the following challenge. Fix our component. I'm intentionally being a bit vague here because I want you to challenge yourself. If you have felt a little bit confused about props and what exactly this object is that we're receiving and so forth, this might be a good indicator that it's time to go back and just review the stuff, practice the stuff that we've already learned. But if you have felt pretty confident here, then I want you to pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Well, one major hint that we can get is if we console log our props. And it might be a little bit confusing to read through here, but you'll notice in the console below that there is an item property in our prop, so props.item, and that item is the object with all of the properties from my data. It might clean it up a little bit if I just log props.item. So with that, it means that all I really need to do is change anywhere I was referring to individual props as a part of the props object, like props.image. I just need to change it to props.item.image. However, we are going to run into one little problem. And what I'll do first is just change everywhere I see props dot to say props.item dot and then the property there. Let me hit save. We'll see where we run into a problem. So it looks like some of it is coming through. We have our title, our price, and our location, but it looks like our review count, our rating, and our image are not working. So if you haven't already figured out why this is broken, I want you to pause the screencast, poke around the code, see if you can figure out how to fix the rest of this component. Because we are passing in the entire item, we now are beholden to exactly the structure and the property names of our data itself. So for example, in our component, we were saying props.img, but in the data, it's the object.coverimg. So if I replace in my card component img with coverimg, now my images should come back. Similarly with review count and rating, these were both part of a sub-object called stats. So if I add stats as a part of my card now, props.item.stats.rating and review count. The rest of that should come back the way we wanted it. Now we can see that our badges are still missing, and that's because way up here, when we're doing this logic, we also need to add props.item so that we're correctly looking at item.location and item.openspots. Let's see if that fixes it. Awesome. We're back to the way we were, but now our component as we use it is a lot simpler. Awesome work. We are so close to done. There is one more little tweak to exactly what we've done here that you might see pretty commonly in React, and so I wanted to make sure that I covered that before it became really confusing when you saw it in the wild. So that's what we will cover next. There is one more little trick to passing properties into a component that I wanted to teach you about, so that when you see it in the wild, it's not terribly confusing, because if you don't know about it, it looks rather confusing. This trick has to do with the object spread syntax. And if you are either not familiar with it or it's been a minute since you've done it, it's an ES6 feature, and I've linked here the MDN docs on using the spread syntax with object literals. But the idea is that instead of creating my own prop called item that I pass the entire object down through, what I can actually do is just put a set of curly braces and spread the item into my component's props. Essentially what this does is it takes the properties of the data, like ID, title, description, price, cover image, stats, location, and open spots, and creates a separate prop for each one of them, kind of like we had before we were passing in the item individually. So it would look like ID equals item.id, title equals item.title, description equals item.description, and so forth and so on until it has covered every property in our data here, or rather every property in the item that we are passing into our component. Now doing this does fundamentally change exactly what props the card is getting because, well, we just changed props so that it said props.item because it was receiving an item object prop. Doing it this way means we would basically go back to the way that we had it before. So if I were to go back to that, I do curly braces, ... item, which spreads all of the properties of this item as separate props into my card component. Back in my card component, I need to go back and get rid of all of my dot items here. Okay, just like that. Oh, I missed a couple here. And actually, you know what? Let me leave those in and we'll see that this is breaking. And well, it looks like it's breaking a little deeper than it was before. So then when I make those changes in the correct way, hit refresh, everything's back to the way that it should be working. On a personal note, I do tend to struggle with this method of passing data down to a component, only because it obscures exactly what we're passing to our component. I personally would rather pass the item down as a very explicit, specific prop that says item is item, and although it does clutter my component a little bit where I have props.item.stats.reviewCount and whatnot, I tend to find that, at least for myself, when I go back, I don't need to first go to the data, understand what properties are there, then go to app and see that I'm spreading that in, then go to the card and look at what those properties are. I don't know, maybe it's just a personal preference. I have tended toward passing objects down like the way that I've shown you here. For your own sake of review, I'm going to put this back to the spread syntax just so you can see what it looks like as the spread syntax. Hit save so we see that it's still working. I'm sure as you write more and more React, you'll settle on which one you like the most, or maybe just stick to a standard in whatever code base you're working in. I'm going to take a second to clean some of this up so that we buy some more horizontal space. And last but not least, let's go back to our app.js component. Let's bring our hero back in, and let's see how things are looking. Awesome. And that, folks, marks everything that we had planned to learn in this section. So before we keep pushing forward in React, let's take just a minute in the next screencast to look back on everything that we've learned in this section and give you a chance to complete another self-assessment project. Before moving on to the next section, we have another solo project for you to work on. Like we talked about before, it's a great opportunity for you to flex these new skills that you've been working on so far in this section, but this time without the security blanket of me being there to help you. Now, the next section we're about to jump into is the heaviest section of this whole course. So it's especially important at this time that you work on this solo project to help gauge your own skills and then decide if you understand these topics well enough to move on. Again, it's projects like these where the real internalization of everything you've been learning actually happens. So, what's the project this time around? You're going to be building a personal travel journal. It's a page where you can list all the fun places that you've traveled, along with some of the details and a photo from your trip. Clicking on the image of this design will take you to the Figma design file. Once you're there, make sure to click on the arrow at the top, choose Duplicate to your drafts, so that your view of the design file won't be cluttered by anybody else's cursors or selections, and also so you can make any edits to this that you want to make. The quickest way to get started will be to code your project here in Scrimba. If you click away from the Google Slides, you'll see a little menu with 3 dots. When you click that, there will be an option to fork this screencast to a new scrim, which will start you off with the starter code that we have here. Once again, I haven't given you a whole lot. I did put this boilerplate code in here for you, but that's about all that I've done for you. So let's take a look at the project requirements. We haven't yet learned how to pull data from an API, but I do want this page to be data-driven. So you'll be creating an array of this data in a separate JavaScript file, and that array should contain objects which have properties for the title, location, the link for Google Maps, a start date to your trip, end date to your trip, the description, and an image URL. If you're using your own photos, you can actually just drag and drop them into the Explorer in the upper left of this Scrimba environment. And then you can just reference the file name of the image instead of an image URL, or if you want, you could just use an image URL of an image out there on the internet. Just so this was perfectly clear, I gave you a little start here. I just took the data from the design file here on Mount Fuji and created an array with a single object in it. This way you at least know the shape of this object so you can make a copy of it and put in your own data. Once you've pulled in that array, I want you to use the map method and props on some custom components to pass that data down to the custom components and have React display the array that has been mapped. And as is always true in these solo projects, you should make sure that it's styled and really polished. You want this to be something that you would be proud to show to someone else. And of course, speaking of which, make sure that you share your work. Again, you don't have to wait until you're completely done with the project. You can always share your current progress in Discord and ask for some code feedback. You can click the Discord icon here that will take you to the I Built This channel where you can share your work. Or if you're doing something like learning in public on Twitter, you can click this Twitter icon, which will open a pre-populated tweet where you can share a link to your project. Good luck building your travel journal, and I really look forward to seeing everybody's finished projects. We find ourselves here at the end of another section, and all I can think to say is nice work. In this section, you have taken a big stride forward in your understanding of React. Let's look at a quick recap of what we've learned. First, and probably most importantly, we have talked about props in React. Props are one of the most fundamental topics in React, and they really make it so you can write more composable code. You can see in both of our projects, we have elements on our page that are essentially reused, both in the Airbnb experiences cards here and the travel journal cards here. Now that you know the concept of props and reusing components with different data, I guarantee as you start paying attention to the websites and web apps that you use online, you're going to see this concept everywhere. Then what props really enables us to do is use data to drive the code and map over it in order to create the website that we're trying to create. Now, although there's only 2 topics here in this recap, those topics are extraordinarily important as we move forward. As always, you should be extremely proud of what you have worked on so far. So I highly recommend that you go over to the Discord server. If you click on the screenshot, it will take you to the Today I Did channel. And even if you don't feel like sharing your code or a screenshot, at least post a message in there that tells people that you have now completed section 2 of the Introduction to React course. Also, this is a very natural time to take a break from your computer. If you've been working on this for quite a while, make sure that you stand up and move around a bit, get something to eat or drink. Your brain does need some time to digest all of this new information that you've been learning. So even if you need to come back tomorrow, that's completely okay. And then whenever you're ready, I will see you in the next section. You have done an amazing job so far, and now we have arrived at probably the most exciting section in this whole course, and that is how we can create interactive web apps in React. Until now, we have basically just been recreating static websites in React. And of course, along the way, we've also learned how we can use props to create reusable components in React. But really, so far, that's only allowed us to create reusable parts of what is still considered a static website. If you think of the Airbnb experiences clone that we just finished building, we left it off in a state that really still didn't allow for any kind of interactivity with the user. On the real Airbnb website, a user can click into those experiences, they can save them to their favorites, and then of course they can actually book that experience and pay for it. So that lets us know that there is so much more that we get to do with React. And that's where you've arrived in this section. To help us better understand what I'm talking about, let's take a look at the difference between static websites and dynamic web apps. The static web pages that we've been doing so far, they're really read-only. They don't allow for any kind of changes to the data. And that's probably the defining attribute of a static web page. Especially in the early days of the web, but still pretty common today, you'll find static web pages like a blog, a news site, recipe sites, and a bunch of others that really don't allow you to change any data, but rather just to read or consume the content that exists on the page. In this section, we are going to be learning how we can use React to also create dynamic web applications. And the defining attributes of these web applications is that they are both read and write. In other words, the user has the ability to change the data that drives the app. As such, they tend to be highly interactive, and instead of displaying the same content for every user, they will display your specific data. And these kinds of web apps drive entire businesses. If you think of, for example, your bank website, or the real version of Airbnb. And this list goes on and on if you think of social media websites or online games or anything that is highly interactive and displays data that's specific to you as the user. You could say they all exist on a tier sort of above a static website because of the amount of interactivity they have. Of course, we're not quite ready to recreate an entire site like Airbnb, so we'll be using this meme generator project to drive forward the curriculum in this section. In this project, when the app first loads, it's going to reach out to an API and get 100 of the most popular meme images at that time, and give the user the ability to enter the text that shows up on top, the text that shows up on bottom, and also to click a button to randomly choose a new meme image. Just like before, you can click the screenshot here to go to the Figma design file. And again, I recommend you copy it to your drafts. So if you click the arrow at the top, duplicate to your drafts, and choose this option, it will put an editable copy in your own Figma drafts that you can use as reference. In order to build this project, we're going to be learning about event listeners and how we can add that dynamic interactive aspect to our web application. We're going to spend a lot of time learning about something called state. We'll officially cover conditional rendering, which you've already had a few sneak peeks at so far. We'll talk about forms and how we can gather data from the user. And we'll learn about side effects and how we can manage side effects in React. Once again, we'll be starting off by building some of the static components of our page here. So if you already feel like you're 100% good on CSS in React, you can skip the first couple lessons where we're mostly just doing some setup and styling for this app. However, I do encourage you once again, if you haven't been practicing your CSS inside of your React, or honestly, even if you're feeling a little bit hesitant on CSS in general, not specific to React, then don't skip those screencasts. Go through those lessons, do the challenges, and that will be a great way to get some additional practice on those topics and set you up for success with the rest of this project. So click the screenshot to open it in Figma, copy it to your drafts, and when you're ready, let's get started on this section, which I'm the most excited about in this whole course. Sometimes if I'm feeling overwhelmed by a project like the meme generator here, where we haven't learned some of the things we need to know in order to complete it, I will break the app down as much as I can into pieces and then see which of those pieces I actually can create. For example, we've spent this entire course so far learning how to build static React sites. And the truth is there are static parts of this site. So the first one we're going to start with is the header. Remember, you can click this screenshot in order to go to the Figma design, which you can use to determine the font sizes, the spacing, this cool purple gradient here, and so forth. So let's start out with that, pause the screencast, and work on building the header component. Well, first I'll get the pieces into place. I'm going to create a separate components folder, although this app is probably small enough that it's not really necessary. I'll just do it for practice sake. I'll create a header.js file inside of my components folder, and I'll just spin up a basic React component here. I'll do that little sanity check that I like to do just to see that it's working on the page. In my app.js, I will import my header. Let's put everything here in a div since I know that I'll have multiple things here. Okay, my header component is showing up. Next, let's get the content on the screen. I know it's not just an H1, so I think I'll surround this whole thing with a header element. And I probably wouldn't call this an H1 because it's not really the main headline of the page. It's sort of in the header itself. So let's maybe call it an H2. Before that, I'm going to have an image. And I already know the source is going to be my image's troll face. And let's see, it needs to be relative like this. That's probably going to be bigger than we want it to be, but we'll fix that in just a minute. And last of all, we have this React course project 3. I can't really decide what it should be. Let's just call it maybe an H4 or something. I know that I'm going to style my header, so I'll go ahead and give it a class name. We'll just say it's header. I'll hit save and go to my styles. Usually with two-dimensional layouts like this in a single line, I will revert to flexbox. So we'll say this is display flex. We'll align everything to the center. From the design, it looks like the height is maybe about 65 pixels. That's making my image overflow a bit. We'll fix the image in just a minute, but I'm going to grab my background, which is from the design, so I'm just going to paste it directly from the design there. The color of the fonts and the text should be white. And there probably should be a bit of padding. I think we have something like 15 on the top and bottom and 20 on the left and right, although it might just be 20 all around. We'll just call it 20 all around. Then I will give some class names to the other elements here. We have header image, header title, and header project. So we'll start with the image. And we'll make sure that this fits within the boundaries of its parent by saying you have a max height of 100%. In the design, it looks like there's also some space, about 6 pixels, so I'll give this margin right of 6 pixels. The header title, it has a font size of about 20 pixels. And I can push my React Course Project 3 all the way to the right by giving my title a margin right of auto. We can see that a little more readily if I make this wider. Oh, and this still says header component. Let's update that to say meme generator. And let's lastly style our project text. That has a fairly small font size. We'll say that's about 12 pixels. And I think the weight is maybe different. Let's give it a font weight 500. And yeah, that does change it, so we'll leave that on there. And you know what? One thing I'm trying to get better at is using rems for my font size instead. 20 pixels over 16 pixels equates to about 1.25 rem. And 12 pixels over 16 is about 0.75 rem. Well, it's exactly 0.75 rem. Awesome work. This is a great start. The next thing we can do is attack this form here. We've got 2 inputs and a button. We're not quite ready to make them functional, but we can at least get them on the page. So let's do that in the next challenge. The next piece of our project that we can bite off is the form that we have right here with the 2 inputs and the button.